Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a new website, then get your domain name and web hosting through Bluehost. Bluehost is easy to use, has great customer support, and easily integrates with WordPress, Google Workspace, and numerous other online tools. Plus, if you get your hosting at my link, then you could potentially get your site promoted via this podcast. Get your hosting through Bluehost at placesandprofiles.com/blue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today I'm speaking with Wes Harris about the West Virginia mine wars. Wes is a sociologist who is a certified underground miner and who has a background as a union organizer. He has been a farmer for over 50 years, and he is the owner, director, and curator of the Our Story Traveling Museum. He is also the board historian for the Mother Jones Community Foundation. He is the editor of Written in Blood, Courage and Corruption in the Appalachian War of Extraction, and When Miners March. For more information, please check out the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/26. Wes, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I greatly appreciate it. So let's start out our conversation today by talking about your own background and your interest in this topic, because as you were telling me prior to recording the show, you're not coming at this the way that a traditional academic tenured professor would. You have your own experience as a miner, your own experiences as a union organizer, and you do have your own background as a labor historian and a sociologist to go with that. So let's just start there. Can you tell us a little bit about your own background and why you're so interested and knowledgeable about this topic?
Mostly by accident would be a fair answer. I was raised in a union household. My dad was a union butcher and meat cutter, but not a particularly activist. Went through graduate school during the Vietnam era, so of course I did everything I could to avoid graduating and got a good, strong education. And I've always supported unions, generally speaking. And then upon graduation, I had a job for a while in Ohio, graduated from Ohio University, moved to West Virginia, and got a little teaching gig at a 2-year business school where all of my students were veterans right out of the Vietnam era. So was an amazing experience. Did a little teaching of labor history, and I knew a little bit about Blair Mountain, so I started telling about it. And one of my students one day said, "Wes, you need to be a coal miner." And I said, "Okay." And a week later, I was. He was the vice president of the local union and got me a job. I don't know what he traded to get me that job, but I'm glad he did. And so I was in the mines for a while. As luck would have it, the union or the mine shut down after a spell. And I ended up being union president just because I knew how to get the paperwork done so all the guys could keep their seniority as they moved on. But basically, I was a union miner for a while, wanted to stay in the mines, work some more. So I went out and worked in a non-union mine in Preston County, which is historically non-union here in West Virginia. Little dog hole, they call it. There were 10 guys. The only reason they hired me was I had an EMT, and they had to have the rules changed. You had to have every mine with 10 employees had to have an EMT on staff. So I worked there for a spell till they found out I was organizing, and then I didn't work there anymore. And I went on to have another career, which was what I really was trained to do, or sort of evolved into. I dealt with geriatric care and care for socially marginal individuals, and that's another story I'd love to tell you someday, but not today. As luck would have it, then in I guess 2004, purely by accident, I stumbled into this guy, William C. Blizzard, and I was actually on another project researching the artwork of Connie West, who her and her husband Don were really important Americans. Dawn was a poet and she was an artist, and I was researching her artwork and trying to collect it so we could share it with people. Again, another story I could tell you one day. But I accidentally met this William C. Blizzard in an old trailer out by the Canal River in Winfield outside Charleston. This guy was in rough shape. He was 87 years old, scruffy beard, no shirt, the whole deal. And I went up, and he couldn't help me a bit with Connie's artwork, even though people said, "Well, I think that old guy knows him." He did, but he didn't have a help her artwork. But lo and behold, just on a whim, I said, "By the way, Mr. Blizzard," as I was leaving, do you know that Blizzard guy who was involved in the mine wars? Well, that was my daddy. And my brain immediately went, oh shit, there goes the rest of my life. Pardon my French. But this was Bill Blizzard's son at 87 years old. And Bill was the absolute indisputed hero of this Battle of Blair Mountain, which was the largest armed insurrection in this country since the Civil War. And I had stumbled onto the old guy when he was literally within a few months of dying. He was in really bad shape. But since my previous career had been geriatric care, I joked that I got his book to publish, but I also got him. So I took care of William C. Blizzard for the last 5 years of his life. Brilliant man. At the age of 92, he was still translating Latin off the top of his head. Just amazing. And so I was hanging out with William C. Blizzard, Bill's son, for 5 years. Ended up publishing his book, which he had written in 1952 when his daddy was still president of District 17, which is the most important union district anywhere in this country, arguably in terms of power. Southern West Virginia coal miners, nobody messed with them. And his daddy was the head honcho. Of course, his daddy worked for John L. Lewis, who was the UMWA's international president. But Bill was the guy here in state. So after much dickering with William C., he agreed I could publish his book. He wanted to rewrite it. And I, no way, we're not going to change a comma because it was primary source written in the 50s. So after much ado, I got it published. Didn't have a clue what I was doing. So we printed 5,000 of them. That's a lot of books. That's 4 by 4 by 4 pallets of books. And my wife at the time says, do we own those? And I said, no, the bank does. But lo and behold, we sold them all. And I was at a book festival down in Charleston, and a fellow from PM Press saw that I was selling a ton of books and came over and said, what do you got? What are you doing? And that led to my relationship with PM Press. That's been absolutely wonderful. And so they published the second version. We did not edit. We just published his book as written in the 50s. Added a few pictures and some commentary around the edges, but his book is as written. And it's been a ride ever since. I've been selling his books, and that led to stumbling into some other stuff that we can talk about later.
Yeah, and we will, and I definitely want to come back to Bill Blizzard here in a little bit. But before we do that, since I assume that most of our audience today is coming from outside of West Virginia, so they might not be familiar with some of the background and understand the significance and the role of coal mines in that state and in Appalachia in general. So for those who don't know a lot about this, can you provide some background of West Virginia and Appalachia and their connection to coal mines and unions and why this is so interesting and important in your part of the country?
Well, I think it's important to the whole country. So I'm really glad we have this exposure through your podcast. West Virginia historically, our Senator Joe Manchin likes to refer to West Virginia as an extraction state or an extractive state. The interests of capital come in and take things out. And so coal was one of the early ones. Coal mining started here, I think, in the 1870s. The UMW was formed in 1890 or 91. And early in the 20th century coal was, if there was coal under you, you were digging it, and there's coal under a lot of West Virginia, particularly southern West Virginia. And of course, this was the industrial era nationally, where our industry was powered by coal. So if the coal mine shut down, the country shut down, would be how it was often put. Incredibly important. Hundreds of thousands of men were mining coal. Not many women until the 1970s, and then never really very many. But it was the engine that drove our industrial power for decades. And it was dug by guys who were willing to go underground and do it. So it's pretty important. The American labor movement, you can look at it a lot of different ways, but I like to think of it as starting effectively in 1877. Out in Martinsburg, West Virginia, actually, at the B&O Railroad, there was a strike. The rail workers were upset, and I don't even remember the specifics, but it ended up being a national strike, a general strike, because it spread out the rail lines. And it's called the Great Upheaval because it was a big deal, but there was not much organization. So it was a flash in the pan, so to speak. Years later in the 1880s, another round of strikes, a little more organized, an outfit called the Knights of Labor. Again, very much opposed to capitalism, but pro-union and wanted to get some organizing going on. Also sort of fizzled. And then it was the 1890s when the United Mine Workers was founded, and organizing took on a much more formalized tenor, I guess you might say. And so from the 1890s forward, the Appalachian coal miners have been the vanguard, the front lines of the American labor movement. And as such, we've been the front lines of being a target from the interests of large money, big money, capital, whatever you want to call it. If you could get rid of the United Mine Workers, you could probably get rid of the rest of the union movement in this country. Well, we're still here in some form.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So before we get into the mine wars itself, because of course that's going to be a large focus of this episode, and we'll come back to Bill Blizzard and Blair Mountain, which you and I were discussing a little bit before we started recording as well. Before we come back to that, can you just paint a picture for the listeners and the viewers? What are the working conditions like in a coal mine? What sorts of people during this time, early 1900s, were going to work in the coal mines? And what was it about their backgrounds and the conditions in those mines that made it so critical from your perspective and from the perspectives of those workers and so many others that unions play such a key role and that union organizing be so important to this?
Well, the conditions in the early mines were pretty much beyond horrible, you could say. There were no safety regulations, and the miners, each mine would generally have a coal camp or a community around that mine where people lived in everything from reasonably adequate housing to shacks, oftentimes on the lower end of that scale. But the people that worked were many times immigrants. It was first generation. So they were people who were escaping even worse conditions, if that was possible, in Europe. And so they thought, great, I'm coming to America, get a job. And, we have towns in West Virginia called like Brooklyn, for instance. Well, they would get off the boat in New York and, I have relatives in Brooklyn, send me there. And so they would find themselves going to Brooklyn to get their new job, and they'd be on a locked train. And when they got off the train, they were in West Virginia at a place that might have a name very similar to an East Coast town. And they had a job. And of course, coming in, they would have maybe not even a language. Maybe they didn't even speak English, but they wouldn't have their tools, wouldn't have anything. So as they came into to work, they would be given their tools for a price, and they would be in debt from day one to the coal company. Oftentimes there would be guards going into the community. They, to get in or out, you had to go past guards. There are places in this state where I could take you. There are machine gun nests up on the side of the mountain where gunners would sit and make sure there were no union activity going into the coal mine. And of course, when you worked in a mine, you would get paid whatever it was. And I don't even remember, the scales was all over, but the wage scale didn't matter, because if I remember here somewhere, I don't know where, I thought I had a couple pieces of scrip here there we go. These little coins here were what you got paid. And it's a piece of metal with a hole in it and the name of the coal company on it. And lo and behold, that's what you got paid. And this coin was only good at the company store, owned by the company. The boss set the prices. Now, this really wasn't your pay. You got paid real money. But you couldn't leave the coal camp to go spend the real money in town, however far away. If you did, you'd miss your work and probably get fired. So people lived in a scrip economy, SCRIP, no T on that. A lot of times people put a T on it. Don't know why. But they would get paid in scrip. A lot of it had a hole in it, so the clerk could look and make sure it was from your mine. Because, for instance, the New River Coal Company had, I think, 15 or 16 mines. Every piece of it had a different hole. This was number 6, or New River number 6. And that was at one mine. Within a couple of miles of this mine would be other mines, same company, different system of money. It was a closed system. You had no choices. So it was not a good situation. If a man got killed in a coal mine, your wife and kids are on the street. We've known this for years. They're out. It's a coal company house, company town. It's for miners. There's no miner here anymore. So the wife and kids were thrown out. Absolutely brutal.
So can you go into a little more detail on this script system and how this worked, and some of the particularly nefarious, I guess we could say, ramifications that this system had, and just
Sure.
some of the problems that this system presented.
Well, hopefully I gotten a little bit to the implied problems. You just never had real money. You weren't a part of the American economy in a way that you weren't going to climb the ladder. The American dream was not something that was available to you. And we've known this for years, and it was bad and blah, blah, blah. Interestingly enough, sometimes miners could move from one mine to the other, and I don't really understand how that worked, but we know they did. But what probably, if I've made a major contribution, besides maybe getting William C. Blizzard's book out, was we discovered the Whipple Company store maybe, I'm guessing 15 years ago. It was run as a museum by Joy and Chuck Lynn, who owned this big building. Joy called me up on the phone one day and said, Mr. Harris, yeah, I saw the article about you in the Charleston Gazette. I think you're really obnoxious, but could I buy a case of your books? Because I tend to be sort of opinionated. So I took a case down to her and was given a tour of the building. It is flat out the most incredible building I've ever been in terms of architecture. I've been blessed in my life to be, in the great cathedrals of Moscow and other places. The Whipple Company store has them all beat. It was designed as a fort, but also designed to be a control mechanism. So the Whipple Company store controlled everything. The floor was specially designed so there was a guy in the middle of it pretending to be a clerk. He was really a guard, and he could hear you whisper anywhere in that building. And I thought, no way. And then I stood on that spot where this guard stood. And yes, you can. It's just amazing. Well, lo and behold, we discovered that I got a tour from Joy that day. And at the end of the tour, she had a couple of people with her. And she told the story of Esau's scrip. And my background as a sociologist kicked in because she started talking about a system of scrip that was different from these little coins. All of us brilliant academics knew, that guy gets killed, wife and kids are on the street. None of us were smart enough to ask the next logical question. What if a guy got hurt in a coal mine and it happened every day? Well, guess what? It was a whole nother world. We discovered at Whipple, and I can't say we've documented this all over the coal fields. Some stories, yes, but within about 50 miles of Beckley, West Virginia, we have now documented, I feel, and others as well, beyond question, there was a system known as Esau, where if a man got hurt in the mine, the wife could go to the store and draw Esau scrip. It's just called Esau. And spend it only on food while hubby's laying in the bed with all the busted this and that. If he went back to work within 30 days, she didn't have to pay. It was a gift from the wonderful coal company. We've learned how wonderful they are. On day 30, if hubby wasn't digging coal, then that piece of paper went from being a gift from the wonderful coal company to being a collateralized note, due and payable in full. Now, hubby's still in the bed. Okay, women weren't allowed to have money. They certainly didn't have any scrip by that time in the game, or they would never have drawn the Esau. They would have spent the scrip they did have. So the Esau they drew on day 30 became a collateralized note that had to be paid back in full if hubby's not working. The collateral on the scrip was the women. It's, to my knowledge, please find another place if you can. To my knowledge, it is the only time in American history where human flesh was used as a part of the economic system, beyond just the traditional sex workers we speak of. The women were expected to go to a certain room in the Whipple store or other stores, and they would be accompanied by guards. Often we call them the gun thugs, who would be hired thugs to control the miners. And when they left the room, the bill was paid. It was a system of institutionalized forced sexual servitude. Now, lots of stories, even to this day, the bad apple or whatever in Hollywood or any industry. But this little piece of paper took it out of the back room, out of just a bad apple, and made it a part of the system. And so to me, this was mind-boggling. And so I spent a number of years, really still that, trying to document if it was real. First, I called in Michael Klein to interview Joy. And he did. He's the incredible oral historian, far better than I am. So Michael did an interview with Joy, got it published in our book and a couple other books earlier. But that was just Joy Lynn talking. That was just the Whipple Company store. So I did interviews and got about 400, 450 people, of whom maybe 20 or 25 confirmed the story from other places, people who did not know what I was asking. I like to play dumb. I say, have you ever heard of something called Esau? And most people would say, no, I never heard of it. But there were those 20 or so people who gave me the story. And they were from a geographically diverse areas, didn't have any connections, never heard of me. And that means we've documented this forced sexual servitude as part of our capitalist system. It's what happens if you don't have any regulation. That's how the system evolves. To me, I mean, maybe other folks don't find it important, but to me, it was critical.
Do we have any sorts of statistics on how many women were affected by this? Is there any way of estimating that, or putting some numbers to understand the scope of this? Or but given the nature of this, do we just have to leave it at, we know this happened and we know that a lot of families were affected by it, but that's as far as we can go?
You're pretty much there. And it's interesting because the reaction we got when we first published about this was, well, it never happened. Couldn't have happened. I remember one guy famously on public broadcasting, guy named Dr. Paul Rakes from WVU, said that couldn't have happened because he went to the courthouse and couldn't find any evidence of it. Okay. And my background is in research methods, and you're not going to find stuff about this in a courthouse. And Paul said, plus he never heard about it when he was growing up. Nobody talked. It just didn't talk. So no, we don't have any statistics. And to this day, I get people saying, well, we need to do more research. Too late. I got lucky, and it wasn't skill, it was luck. I got lucky, stumbled into it while there were still survivors, while there were still daughters and sons of survivors alive who did talk. But no, don't tell me you're going to be a PhD candidate and write a dissertation on this now and go out and interview some people. Good luck. They're dead. And that's what happens so often to our history. Well-meaning academics, and we need to do some research on this. I want to see a study. Where were you 20 years ago? Where were you 40 years ago? Where was I? Well, I was doing other stuff too. But certainly folks in mainstream academia never asked the right question or didn't want to hear the answers.
All
I
right,
don't know if that answers your question or not, but
yeah, no, it definitely does. From here though, I want to take a step back. So we've been looking at one piece, I guess we could say, here with Esau scrip, one piece of the West Virginia mine wars and coal company policies and the way that this affected coal miners and their families. Can you more broadly, because we've used this term West Virginia mine wars, you quoted Joe Manchin earlier talking about the extraction component of this. Can you a little more broadly just talk about, when we say West Virginia mine wars, what exactly are we talking about here? How did extraction play a role? And then any key figures or battles or events, any key particulars of this that you think people
Sure.
listening and watching this should know about?
Well, let me ramble on a little bit, and then you could point me in a different direction. How that
Let's do it. Sounds like a plan.
The mine wars are kind of the fad of the week right now. There's a West Virginia Mine Wars Museum and this and that. And 20 years ago, it wasn't. 20 years ago, you didn't hear about it much. Now I think it's a pretty safe topic, so you could talk about it sort of. But the mine wars generally refers to that period of time from, again, roughly 1890s when the Union was formed, up through the 1920s, really until the Battle of Blair Mountain and the trials after it. With an incredibly violent time then. And after that, there were certainly conflicts about whether or not we're going to organize the mines with the Union and this and that. But the flat out guns, and the company having a piece of an artillery piece that they shot at the miners, those times were pre-1932, generally speaking. So that's referred to as the mine wars. I don't like that term. I used to, but I don't use it anymore. Because that was just one phase, and it's interesting. And I could teach an 8th grader or a high school student or a college student about it, but they can't use it. How is that going to affect your life? No, not at all, but it's kind of a cool story, Wes. So I talk about the war of extraction. And it's basically the maybe not politically correct, but for lack of a better way of looking at it, it's the conflict between labor and capital, and the folks with the money and the folks that do the work. And so the conflict in West Virginia has been in coal, it's been timber, it's been in currently a lot of it's in the gas and oil industry. And the interests of people who own that stuff, at one point, it's been years ago, maybe it's even worse now, but a statistic I got was 2/3 of West Virginia was owned by out-of-state interests. Like, whoa, I wonder what's going on here, So the mine war, to me, I find it interesting because it was the most violent and certainly laid the groundwork for things that would happen later. But it's all one story. It's all one conflict. And we need to talk about the violence. We need to talk about Blair Mountain. And interestingly enough, there was even more violence or as much in Tennessee before miners in West Virginia organized. In the 1890s, in Coal Creek, Tennessee, there was this huge battles where after the Civil War, the state of Tennessee, in their wisdom, decided we have a problem. We've got too many black folks running around claiming to be free. So let's arrest them, send them to jail, lease them out to the coal companies, let them be coal miners. And in Coal Creek, Tennessee, the government leased a bunch of prisoners to the companies. Miners found themselves watching as prisoners dismantled their houses to build a stockade to hold the miners who were prisoners. Big fights. And the Tennessee militia used a cannon against the miners there. So big fights, a lot of guns. So that the mine wars, to the extent we talk about just mine war, think a lot of violence. Think literally artillery pieces. In Tennessee, the government owned it. In West Virginia, the artillery piece that we know about, which is in my museum now on loan, was used by the companies. It was a Hotchkiss, 37 millimeter, I think, mountain rifle. It's a rifle barrel, breech loading, but it's an artillery piece, and they used it against the miners. And I remember the comment was made that, well, that was the coal company's early version of labor negotiations. So the absolute line between labor and capital in the mine war was pretty straightforward. Which team you're on was not a question. That, of course, has blurred as we've come forward, because as the unions come in, the unions got away from being radical, if you will, or socialist. The men got to where they were making a pretty good living if you were a union miner, or even if you're not today, because the company will pay you extra to stay out of the union. So all of a sudden, the mining community had a vested interest in the economic system, and things evolved. And so if we understand these early foundations and see as an evolution to today, in some ways we're better off and in some ways we're not. But if we understand where we came from, we have a better chance to decide which way we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in these wars, when we talk about these battles between, who has the money and who maybe doesn't have the money, but's actually doing the labor, doing the work. And we talk about the exploitation here. And of course, with Esau scrip in your description of that earlier, we got into, a particularly terrible piece of this. But can we talk a little bit more about some of the abuses and some of the more draconian aspects of the policies of the coal companies, of the people who did have the money, towards the people who were working in the mines and did not have the money and the resources?
Okay. Well, it was just, again, I tried my best to pull out. I think particularly like a good example would be in I think it was 11. Hope it wasn't 13. Right in there somewhere. There was strikes on Cabin Creek and Paint Creek. Those 2 years were noted, and they're just referred to as the creeks here in West Virginia. But they were each of them maybe 20 miles long, a creek from the Canal River up into the mountains. Coal camps all the way up and down. And interestingly, on Paint Creek, there was only one town that was not company owned, lock, stock, and barrel, and that was Hollygrove. Well, there were some strikes. Miners ended up pitching their tents because you can't stay in a company house if you're on strike. So the miners pitched tents at Hollygrove, and as a way of suppressing it, the coal operators, aided and abetted by the sheriff of Talk County, of course, had an armored train called the Bull Moose Special that went up Paint Creek one night, many times actually, but one night in particular, and guns a-blazing just shot up the tent colony there at Holly Grove. And of course, the miners fought back. Amazingly, there was only one guy killed, a fellow by the name of Cisco Estep. And it was just a fluke that the gun slits on this armored train were mounted too high, basically, and they couldn't aim the machine guns down below the train where the miners were hiding. So Cisco was killed, but nobody else. But any miner that got killed on Cabin Creek or Paint Creek couldn't be buried in company dirt. So if you go to Paint Creek today, to Holly Grove, the free town, there's a graveyard up on the hillside. I mean, it's remote. And I take students up there and ask them, why are we there? Why would I bring you up to this old remote graveyard? And they look at me like I'm about half nuts. And I tell them, well, I'll tell you what, I like to share this story. I ask them, have you ever heard of that, and I play dumb, of course, and that's easy for me. Have you heard of that restaurant chain, the Thank God It's Friday, TGIF? Oh, yeah. Well, what's the big deal? Well, it's Friday, it's your weekend. And I pointed out to them, you're standing on the graves of the people who gave you the weekend. Because probably, not for sure, but probably that graveyard, that you've got to know how to find it, in Holly Grove, West Virginia, there are more people buried there who died fighting for those weekends than anywhere else in the country. And when I take students up there on this horrible road, I say, what's wrong with this road? And they look at me like, oh, besides potholes, I don't know. And I say, well, where is Ranger Rick? And they look at me like, what? Where is the park ranger? Why isn't this a national park? And they, duh. And then I go up and show them Cisco Estep's grave, little tiny markers, all that's there. And yet that ground is sacred to me and to many others. And very few people even know where he's buried. And all the other stones up on that graveyard, many of them are unmarked. There's just a stone. But it was people killed up and down Paint Creek and Cabin Creek by the gun thugs. So I don't mean to get off on a tangent there, but that's some level of the brutality, and the people just don't know. So I think it's important when my students come off Holly Grove, they know. They may forget it, but they know.
Yeah, so let's go from there and shift into talking about some of the specific battles and incidents and figures in a little more detail. And you've obviously done some of this already, but towards the very beginning of our conversation, you mentioned Bill Blizzard, and we haven't really gotten into detail about him. We had a mention of Blair Mountain earlier. We haven't really gone into detail about that. I know you've mentioned to me separately prior to our beginning to record this about the Redneck Army. So can you talk a little bit about who Bill Blizzard was, what the Redneck Army was, what happened at the Battle of Blair Mountain, and then if there are any other significant battles or figures during this time that you think would be important to discuss in addition to Blair Mountain, if you could give a little bit of an overview of those as well.
Well, as I mentioned, Cabin Creek and Paint Creek in the early in the century, down in southern West Virginia. But Blair Mountain was the culmination. Some folks have written about something called the Matewan Massacre. It wasn't. It was just a gunfight down in Matewan, where Sid Hatfield, the chief of police in Matewan, who was pro-union, and that's pretty unusual for a union guy, a chief of police to be a pro-union guy. But he was murdered. There was a shootout with some Baldwin Felts guards. It's a long story, but it was like the straw the last straw broke the camel's back. And the miners said, wait, they killed Sid Hatfield. He's our hero. So the miners started organizing, and they were going to, just as a mass movement, march into southern West Virginia, taking the Union down there and clean up those non-union mines. And of course, the non-union mines in southern West Virginia were involved in the scrip system. Up north, by this time, by 1919, 20s, thereabouts, there was unionization on some level anyway. The miners were better off. Well, if the mines in southern West Virginia could pay scrip and the ones up north had to pay money, and you were an operator, something had to give, because the southern mines could compete, especially once the railroads got down there and could haul the coal north. So many things contributed, but basically in 1921 in the fall, Sid was killed, big blow up, and the miners were furious. So there was a little go back and forth between the government and this and that. But essentially the miners said, we're going down to Mingo County. On to Mingo was the slogan. And we're going to clean this mess up. And the guys who could afford it, keep up with $1.98, went to Charleston, For $1.98, you could buy an '03 Springfield, which was a World War I surplus rifle, powerful rifle, 30-06 caliber. And these guys were armed. There were many of them veterans of World War I, and they formed up an army. And it was the redneck army. You notice my fancy tie here today. I always wear my redneck tie if I'm going to be doing something like this. And they formed up an army, and they were intent to move south. And we're going to clean house and organize southern West Virginia. And this was in 21. And lo and behold, John L. Lewis was president of UMW. He's often referred to as St. John. My good friend Julian Martin, who recently died, was an incredible environmentalist, but also many generations of miners recalled growing up. And if he was in school and somebody asked who's the president, they'd say John L. And that's who the president was John L. Lewis. So it was a big deal. Well, John L. was president of UMW, and he did not want the miners to march into southern West Virginia. He did not want to see a bloodbath, a bunch of violence. Some thought the miners would get their butts kicked. Others thought otherwise. But John L. opposed the march. Again, very complex, and then get into as many weeds as you want. And I don't really know it all, but basically John L. said, no, guys, we're not going to do this crazy violence thing. Violence is not the way to go with it. Not that John L. was, totally Mr. Mellow, but he said no. The two guys who were the head honchos of District 17 at the time, a guy by the name of Fred Mooney and Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, I believe it was. Longtime socialists, good union organizers, but they worked for John L. And he said no. So they split. They went to Columbus before the march started, probably being prudent. First, they didn't want to cross the boss. Secondly, they were afraid of being lynched or killed the same way Sid had been killed. So I'm not saying that the Mooney and Keeney were cowards, but they certainly weren't part of the Blair Mountain battle. Well, you know how bureaucracies work. It kicked down, and Bill Blizzard was, I think, president of Sub-District 2 of District 17. Not a big title, particularly, but he fell into the right place at the right time and ended up leading this group of men who wore the red bandana. Got to know, and if you're in the woods and everybody's got a gun, you got to know who to shoot. That's what this was about. The company gun thugs often wore a white armband as their uniform. And that seems a little more like a target to me, but that was their choice. But the Redneck Army formed up, marched into southern West Virginia. There was a huge battle down on Blair Mountain, included aircraft. Many textbooks will say, oh my gosh, the only time Americans were bombed on their own turf. We now know that wasn't true. The Army Air Corps wanted to bomb the miners. They did send in aircraft. Billy Mitchell, World War I ace, was hot to trot. So let's bomb those miners and get more money for airplanes, because they were trying to convince the Senate what a fantastic weapon airplanes were. They'd been powerful in World War I in Europe, but the Senate was over here. So the Army sent in airplanes. They did not drop bombs on the miners. Never got the orders, okay? Didn't happen. But the miners were bombed. They were bombed by at least 5 aircraft that the Island Creek Coal Company leased out of Kentucky. And I've just learned in the last year, they didn't bomb the miners either. The head of the squadron was a guy by the name of Halloran, Earl Halloran, I believe, had been a World War I flight instructor for the military, was barnstorming. He was a pilot. He loved to fly. One of West Virginia's very first pilots. So he hired on with Island Creek, supposedly to do surveillance. Realistically, they wanted him to drop some of these homemade bombs on them too. But Halloran didn't. And we now know this from his nephew, who recounts the story, that when they were flying over the miners and they were looking down, they could see state troopers, guess whose team they were on, and the miners about to have this big shootout up on Blair Mountain. Well, Halloran, again, he was no fan of the miners' union, but he wasn't a big fan of the company. He was just a pilot. So they dropped their bombs deliberately between the miners and state troopers. About scared to poop right out of both sides. They split up and saved a bunch of lives. And we just learned that story in recent weeks, in recent months, rather. But Earl Halloran was the pilot. They did drop bombs on the miners, in quotes. And that was a big deal. And of course, it was a big deal then later when Blizzard was on trial and they took one of these bombs into the courtroom to show what a horrible, situation it had been. One of them didn't explode, and they hauled one into the courtroom. But long story short, and I'm not really good at making short stories, Blair Mountain sort of fizzled. The troops came in. The miners would not fire a shot against troops because those are our boys. Miners were still wearing their World War I uniforms and their red bandana, of course. So not a shot was fired. Blizzard gets onto the troop train where the troops are coming in and agrees to disarm the miners, to send them home. Interestingly enough, because we hear how Blizzard was so radical in us, he gets onto a federal troop train with a pistol in his pocket. Guess what? He got off of that train still with his pistol. If he had been some kind of a terrorist or a treasonist, you think the federal troops would have let him keep his gun? I mean, it's ridiculous. Bill gets up, but he said, "Okay, we'll come out if you get the other guys to disarm too." So the agreement was reached. Both sides disarmed. The miners went home, and that was the Battle of Blair Mountain. 3 days of shooting. Don't know how many were killed. More than the 16 that the State Museum says, but don't know how many. Probably not as many as should have been, because if you look at the guns they were using, the weapon of choice was this .03 Springfield from World War I. It had a defective sight. The sight on the .03 was in front of the bolt action, and that gave it a bias to shoot high at short range. Blair Mountain had been largely timbered. They were shooting at 50 yards or 100 yards, short range-ish, and they were shooting over each other's heads. By World War II, the military figured it out, moved the sight back on the .03 to right where the stock starts. Now it was very accurate wherever you want to shoot it, and they used the .03 Springfield all the way to Vietnam as an anti-sniper weapon. In a little sideshow, but not really, because it's an important part of our history. Why weren't more killed on Blair Mountain? It's probably because this silly gun wouldn't shoot straight. And so we've got those little side stories. But anyway, the men went home after the fight. And it wasn't very long before they started handing out indictments. All state indictments. There were no federal charges against any miner. But there were several hundred miners indicted on state charges, including treason, arson, murder, you name it. Again, long story. But basically, the miners were shipped out to Charlestown in the eastern part of our state for trial, the same courthouse where John Brown was tried. They asked Bill Blizzard, "Well, how do you feel about being tried in the same courthouse as John Brown?" "Well, I guess we was both just trying to end slavery." And so that was his response. He was on trial first because he had been the ringleader, by all accounts, although nobody would admit it. Nobody talked. A little bit like the Esau story. Nobody talked about Blair Mountain because they were afraid of repercussions. But Bill was put on trial, and again, I think it was 200 were put on trial, maybe 500 indicted. Bottom line was the trials fizzled. Bill was acquitted, and there was much cheering about it all. But the real story is, during this trial, Blizzard was the guy. He had a wonderful lawyer, a guy named Houston, Harold Houston, I think. But Bill came up with this way: we've got to make friends. So the miners all stayed in Charlestown in the homes of the local people, okay, and paid them for the lodging during their trials. It was capital. They were all going to be hung. And I got to share this. I hope you can see it a little bit. This is the baseball that the miners used when they were on trial. They would go out after court and play baseball with the friends and family of the jury. Now, if you go down to our wonderful state museum in Charleston, they've got a softball. And saying, in their free time, the men played baseball during their trials. Pure, flat out lie, and they know it. First off, that's the baseball. It's not a softball. Coal miners play hardball. But it wasn't in their free time. They played ball to make friends with the friends and family of the jury. Hello, ain't nobody gonna hang. Wait a minute. These are the same guys that were in church with us on Sunday, and they paid real well too. Nobody's gonna hang a good Christian third baseman. Blizzard and most everybody else got acquitted. Much celebration, and that opened the door for the American labor movement for the next 50 years or more. The intent of American capital, without question, was to hang a couple hundred coal miners as a result of Blair Mountain. Having completed that execution, whatever, The intent was, okay, let's go after the rail workers, the Teamsters, the steel workers. Let's nip this labor union shit in the bud and get rid of it. And if Blizzard had been killed and these other guys had been swinging from trees, the American labor movement almost certainly would have been decimated. It's a big deal, but nobody knows the story. So, well, again, Blizzard then kind of backed off. John L. Lewis wasn't a real big fan of his, so Blizzard went to the background for a number of years. And in the late 20s, he would come back in more or less in John L. Lewis's good graces. And it was Bill Blizzard who organized the state of West Virginia in about 2 years' time for the United Mine Workers. And he would stay as president or as an official of District 17 all the way up to 1955. Long story short.
If you're interested in starting a website, then use Bluehost. I use Bluehost for placesandprofiles.com, and it's great. Their customer support is quick, responsive, and helpful, and it works well with WordPress, WooCommerce, Google Workspace, and countless other online tools. As an added bonus, if you get your domain name or hosting through my Bluehost link, then I will mention your website on the show and link to your website on placesandprofiles.com, as long as your website is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Bluehost and get your domain name and hosting today by going to placesandprofiles.com/blue. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/blue. Yeah, well, so now that you've taken us up to 1955 with the end of Bill Blizzard's tenure there, and you made comments about how this affected the next 50 years. So I want to use this as a way to transition to some more recent events. And when I say recent, obviously we're still talking about things that happened decades ago, but at least more recent than events of the 20s and 30s. So can you take a moment? There are two things that I want to highlight here. So one is from 1968, and that's the Farmington Mine disaster. And one is from 1972, and that's the Buffalo Creek flooding disaster. Can you talk a little bit about what those two things were and how those fit into this larger story?
Absolutely. And I'm going to add a third one, much more recent, the Upper Big Branch disaster, where I think 29 or 26 or 29 miners were killed. And there have been others. But certainly.
Yeah, and can you, sorry to interrupt, can you put a year to Upper Big Branch?
I can't right off the top of my, wait a minute, maybe I can. I've got to, let me just see.
Because I know that was
all right. Here we have
reasonably recent
report on it. It's the first time the miners union came out and called industrial homicide what it was. And again, I apologize, but there's too many dates and I'm getting too many gray hairs.
You know what? I'll look it up. Tell us the stories about the three events and I'll look it up while you're talking.
Yeah. But anyway, let's go back and maybe pick up at Farmington first.
Yeah,
Farmington was the first nationally televised mine disaster. And many of you have seen the pictures from Farmington, big billowing smoke over the tipple. It was a mess. Number 9 blew up, killed 78 fellas, and nothing good you could say about it. There are still 19 fellas buried there. Joe Manchin, our senator, likes to talk about his uncle is still entombed in number 9, that horrible accident. And I immediately say no. Joe Manchin may have a relative in mine, but it wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. Flat out, no doubt. How do I know? You say, well, let me see here. It's been, again, 8-10 years. I was out at a festival selling books, teaching. That's my favorite classroom is at a arts and crafts fair. That's best students in the world come up in front of me. This guy says, I'm not going to tell you who I am, but you need to file a Freedom of Information Act request. Well, okay, what about it? He liked my books. Tell me what do you want to know? He says, down in Beaver, outside of Beckley, West Virginia, is a memo in a box that documents what happened at Farmington. It was by a federal mine inspector by the name of Larry Lane, who discovered that the cause of the Farmington mine was car jumper cables around the safety on the Mods Run fan. The fan had been breaking down. It wouldn't work. It's a problem. Let's just take these car jumper, because if a fan shuts down, you got 15 minutes to evacuate the mine. Alarm sound, you got to get out because no air. So, guys, you need to look this up. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. Just happened to know somebody that worked there, and they just happened to respond to that request in like a week, which is unheard of. And in our book, Written in Blood, a little commercial here, we actually printed a copy of the memo from Larry Lane, federal inspector, that said that these cables had sabotaged the safety on that mine. Well, we can't afford to shut the mine down. We got to keep running coal. And that's what happened. They ran coal for an hour and a half, and then it blew up and killed everybody. 78 of them anyway. The story never got told. Bonnie Stewart, a wonderful book of hers. I'm going to give you a plug to a couple books here. Number 9, written by Bonnie Stewart, a professor at WVU. Well, she's no longer there. She's out on the West Coast somewhere now, I'm told. But she actually knew about this memo, didn't print a copy of it, focused her book more on the personal side of it. It's a good book, but she never really put her thumb on it, in an ouchy kind of way. And it needed to happen. So we printed the memo, actual photocopy of it. So now it can't be hidden anymore. And Larry Lane is the guy that did it. As it turned out, the miners from Farmington, I think they got $10,000 for the, in quotes, accidental death of their husbands. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. Just an opinion, but you all can have your own opinions too. Anyway, so Larry did that. And then lo and behold, jumping around a little bit ahead of the Buffalo Creek thing, it was about 10 years later, in the early 80s, Larry had been promoted to special investigator for the mine safety people. There was an explosion down at Whitwell, Tennessee, at the Grundy 21 mine, killed 13 guys. Larry Lane was pulled in to investigate it. The official report, which is here somewhere, indicates that it was caused by smoking. The miners were smoking. And the company ultimately paid a small fine for miners smoking in the mine. Guess what? Larry goes in, just investigates, and discovers they didn't have a ventilation plan that was adequate. Not even close. It was the fault of the federal inspector who had been kind of winked at what's going on. Yeah, the men were smoking, but the mine was not known to be gassy. It was a fluke. And if they'd had an adequate ventilation, it wouldn't have blown up. Larry would go on and testify at the Kennedy hearings at the Senate about this, and that would lead to, again, some more regulations. The widows from Whitwell got $1 million. And Larry, he mentioned it, and I never noticed it. The end of his article, we interviewed Larry Lane in our book, Written in Blood. The end of that, he talks about he was able to help Whitwell, and I didn't even know about that. I was totally ignorant, and I was till just recently. But he had gone on and been an incredible hero for the women down there. He said, well, I hope the women from Farmington get their $1 million. They didn't. The courts ruled, oh, it's been too long. So the Farmington widows basically got shut out with minimal reimbursement. So anyway, that's a little bit of a distraction, but I think it's important because Larry Lane was arguably the most important person in terms of mine safety in the last 50 years. And again, nobody knows. It just got buried. I missed it for years. I went right over it. And another important fellow was the Buffalo Creek disaster. Was big flood, a strip mine, surface pond flooded, killed I think 128 folks. Incredible mess. And Jack Spadaro, as a glorified grad student, I mean, I don't know whether he graduated or not, but he was at WVU. He was appointed to be on the committee to figure out what caused the problem. The dean of the School of Mines, I guess, up there put Jack in a lead role. And Spadaro discovered, what had happened there, that they'd been getting warnings for decades that these mine impoundments were gonna fail. They were just earthen dams. You put enough stuff behind a dirt dam, and sooner or later, water wins, and heavy water really wins, and the stuff up there is really heavy because God knows what all's in it. So Spadaro led the investigation into that, and I remember him telling the story that he was in a meeting one time, and I think it was the dean said, "Spadaro, shut up, or you're not going to have a job Monday morning." Spadaro never shut up. He's about my age now, and he went on to become an incredibly important mine inspector and just real key player. I learned a couple of months ago, Larry Lane was a mentor to Jack Spadaro. So this Lane guy has this key role in terms of mine safety, probably, arguably, I think, more important than any union official in terms of getting results. Nobody knows about him. And it's just, the more I play around with this stuff, the more stuff hits me up the side of the head. and say, "Did you know this, Wes?" No, I never knew to look under that rock. And that's what it's all about. Uh, Buffalo Creek killed, again, about 128. After both Buffalo Creek and Farmington, there were new mine safety regulations put in place. I don't pretend to know the specifics, but there were new regulations, and everybody goes, "Yay, new regulations! It's all better now." In fact, the State Museum in Charleston has a big thing saying, following the regulations that came in place after Buffalo Creek, blah blah blah, much safer, everything's good now. It's not true. Okay, it's not good. There's going to be more of these slurry impoundments fail. Every time there's a big rain down south, I just watch the news and wait to hear about it. But those two disasters did lead to more regulation, but it's not all better yet. And the other big disaster that miners face is black lung. We've got more black lung now than we had 30, 40, 50 years ago on a per capita basis, because there's more dust. And the capital intensive machinery that we're using now creates a finer dust. We grind up more rock than we used to, which the silica is more dangerous in some ways than coal. I'm no doctor. I don't know all this stuff, but I know that they're having a tremendous problem with miners in their 30s with black lung today. And so, yeah, every new regulation is written in the blood of dead coal miners, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be more blood. I don't know. Did I ramble enough?
No. That's great. That's great. So while you were talking, I looked up Upper Big Branch, and if you could take a moment to talk a little bit more about that. But I looked up the date for Upper Big Branch, I should say, which was 2010. And I know Upper Big Branch. I did remember, that had happened. I couldn't place exactly. Was it 2010? Was it 11? Was it 12? Somewhere in there. But I do remember that happened, and I know that that disaster was maybe in the national consciousness through politics more than it was for what actually happened to the miners, because in 2018, when Joe Manchin was up for re-election, one of the contenders on the Republican side was Don Blankenship, who was CEO of the company that controlled the Upper Big Branch mine. And given how close control the U.S. Senate seems to be every time that we have elections in this country, there were a lot of eyes on that outside of West Virginia. So that maybe after the fact, in a way that was not that was kind of missing the point in some respects, brought added attention to that incident. But can you talk a little bit more about Upper Big Branch and what happened there? Because that's, as you said, that is kind of part 3 of this. And Farmington, Buffalo Creek, there were in 1968, 1972. For Upper Big Branch, we're fast forwarding 38 years after Buffalo Creek to 2010.
Right. Hang on with me just a second here. Back in the back of that book, there's Bob Henry's comments. Anyway, my wonderful partner is helping me here a little bit. There we go. Bob Henry Weber, who is a tremendous fellow and a poet, was one of the original soup bean poets, shares this little ditty about Upper Big Branch. And we contextualized it by saying the Upper Big Branch mine in southern West Virginia exploded April 5, 2010. 29 miners died. The cover of the UMWA report says it was industrial homicide. Weber's little poem was, "Never forget, Joe Manchin flew back to the scene of Upper Big Branch crime on Don Blankenship's dime." Okay. Joe was, I think, down in Florida, hopped on Blankenship's airplane to get back to West Virginia when Upper Big Branch blew. Now what does that tell us? There's some stuff there. Now I'm not saying those guys are big buddies now, but when that happened, Joe Manchin was so much in the pocket of Blankenship and company that he rode his airplane to get back here. Now, do you think Manchin's really going to get hardcore about investigating that if the mine was owned by Blankenship? I'll let you decide. But yeah, that's just the kind of, and all of these disasters, okay, all of them. But I can't even think of an exception. This little toy right here would have prevented them. Okay, this is an antique, but it would work just as well today. It's an anerometer. If you've got this at the face of a coal mine where the coal is, and this thing's not going around, you don't have any air. And if you don't have any air, then the gas that's inside the coal can come out and go boom. I think it's, I don't know, maybe 5 to 15% or 5 to 10% methane is explosive. So as long as you dilute that methane with enough air, you cannot blow up a coal mine. A legal coal mine cannot have an explosion. If you hear about an explosion in a coal mine, they're not running legal, period. Okay. Duh, somebody's cheating. It's best I shut up. You can't say any more than what that little machine can say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of not saying anything, so kind of a theme running through a lot of your comments today has been connected to things that we're not supposed to know and we're not supposed to talk about, and the people and the descendants of those who went through this are not supposed to talk about. So it some of this is obvious to anyone who's listening or watching this, but some of this may not be. Can you talk a little bit more about why so much of this is censored and why so much of this history is unknown to the general public?
Well, obviously, it's a matter of opinion. My approach to it, and the reason I teach this stuff, if I won't teach something, history's all, and again, we don't, I'm not even, I'm trying to get away from history. You know, after the whole Esau story, it's, wait a minute, that's not history, that's her story. And then we renamed our museum to the Our Story Traveling Museum because it's ours. Okay. And this whole idea of censorship is so that we don't know our story. And if we teach our story in a way, history in a way, that those who learn it are not dangerous to the folks who have money, teach away. Well, we'll even give you a classroom. But if what we teach could corrupt those tender young minds to where they feel like, oh, maybe I need to take control of my life. We need to take control of our lives. Why is all that coal going that way and there's not any money staying here? They're coming back this way. You know, if it's not useful, if it's not dangerous, it's not really our story. I guess would be one way of, you know, when I drive up and down the hollows here in this state, and my gosh, the wealth that's been taken out, and I see not wealth, I see drugs. I see, you know, Oxycontin and all this stuff. Why is that? Well, it's depression. Why are people depressed? Hopeless. Why are they hopeless? Spend your whole life digging your grave. Does not really lead for a hopeful situation. So again, I teach it because if it's not dangerous, meaning if that doesn't mean we get to keep more of our stuff, then it's not important. So obviously, if it's dangerous in that we got to keep more coal or we get to keep more profits from our timber, or we don't have to destroy our landscape because we're going to, you know, put a pipeline through it, or we're going to destroy our water table because of surface mining or because of fracking. Okay. All of those kind of things are dangerous to the people who want the Appalachian War of Extraction. They want to take our goodies. And they have for over a century, and it still continues and gets worse rather than better, I fear. And yet, oftentimes we bought into it. You know, we'll agree to just keep that job for another little while. What are coal miners doing today? But, you know, oh my gosh, those horrible environmentalists. That's not really the case. But what are we going to do? We got to keep the mines open. We can't have solar. We can't have wind power. We got to keep these coal mines up. Baloney. You know, but we're not taught to look forward. I don't know. Just it's hard to know what to say sometimes.
Yeah, sure.
It's
Yeah, you know, sometimes it is, and sometimes change is hard. But as we move to wrap up here, you made mention just now of the Our Story Traveling Museum. So, can you talk a little bit more about that, and anything that you want to say about your books as well that we haven't gotten to? Obviously, we've talked about a lot of the main themes and individuals and events covered in them. But anything you want to say about your books? Anything you want to say about your traveling museum?
Sure.
Go for it.
Just quickly, I'm really grateful for the opportunity. The Wind Miners March, I call it my book, but it's really William C.'s book. I'm just the midwife. I just got it published for him. And I think we've sold like 30,000 copies, which isn't too bad for a local thing. Written in Blood just brings it up to date. It's an anthology. The Spaderos, the Larry Lane, we got an interview with Larry Lane in the book. It's a collection of articles, but they're all stuff that's been pushed to the back burner or buried. I didn't plan it, okay, but they really are a collection or an anthology or whatever, not a collection, but a set. A set would be a good word. They go together. The Traveling Museum really began in 2004 when I met William C. Blizzard. And he had an incredible collection of his dad's artifacts. The baseball was in a closet where he lived. This little watch right here has changed how we look at mine history. This is, I don't know if you can see it or not. There we go. That's Bill Blizzard's gold watch. Okay, his daddy's gold watch, and it was given to him to Bill Blizzard from the Kanawha, Beckley, McDowell, Mingo, and Logan boys. That's the Redneck Army. So for all those textbooks out there that say, well, Blizzard couldn't have led the march, or he was, controlled by elsewhere, Blizzard's the only one that got a gold watch. He was the one the men followed. So that's in the museum. I've just been given an incredible collection of artifacts by William C. and then by people following that, rightly or wrongly, who come to trust me as I won't sell out. And so people trust me with things like saying, Wes, you need to file a Freedom of Information Act. Here's where this document is. Go look for it. And it just keeps coming. The stuff in Tennessee, I spent the better part of last year working to take the Traveling Museum to a major university in Eastern Tennessee. And after 9 months of full-time work and meeting the Coal Creek Museum, meeting the Whitwell people, incredible stuff, the Tennessee academics haven't touched. Okay. They said, no, we decided you got a wonderful collection, Wes, but you need to find somewhere else. So we got kicked out. Go elsewhere. Okay, well, guess where we're going? I got to show you this. You can't even see it yet. This is the new picture book of the Traveling Museum. I'm getting too old and I can't cover enough venues. So we're going to put together a book. All the artifacts that I've got will be in there with my Facebook posts. If anybody wants to check my Facebook, I've got posts from the last 2 or 3 years. Artifact of the week. And they're kind of lighthearted, but poking fun, but accurately. And then we've got some narratives by Dr. Klein, Dr. Baber, myself, Dr. Teresa Burris gave us wonderful reviews. So we're trying to get this history out to where people can get access to it. And that's what I know.
All right. So before we part ways and conclude this conversation, if you want to take a moment, if there's anything that we haven't discussed yet that you think is important for listeners to understand, talk about that, as well as if you want to talk a little bit more about where to follow your work or any resources that you recommend people check out. Anything that you want to add that you think is important to either what you do and what you want people to see from what you do, or the sorts of things that we've talked about today and ways for people to learn more about that.
Well, I wish we were doing this in 6 months. Maybe we'd have our new book out. We've got a website, but it's just 2 pictures right now. We've got a gal putting it in. But we're going to put the museum in it. It's going to be, I think, ourstoryappalachia.org. So right now, chase me down on Facebook. Just Wes Harris, WESS, 2S. Glad to have people email me. I'll try to respond as often and as quick as I can. I just have not been very good at that whole marketing thing or teaching. Been busy doing this kind of stuff, but that gets in the way. One of the things we get from academics is, I'm so busy, I've got to teach, I've got students, I've got committees, but they're not doing this stuff. Well, I'm out pounding the pavement, so to speak, been blessed with incredible collections, but I have not been good at getting the word out. So maybe some of your viewers will reach out to me, and if you've got a venue, I'll come anywhere, just pay my gas, so to speak. I can no longer afford to just go places without getting reimbursed, but I don't need to make money. Let me sell books. The reason I do this is to teach. I got too many gray hair. My time is going past. It's time for the next generation, but I got to get access. That was one of the cool things about being invited to a museum in East Tennessee. Students. Well, apparently they decided they didn't want me to have students. They wanted their professors to write our narrative. No, I'll close with this. It's our story. And I insisted that we write it. Okay. Not a bunch of professors. Some did, Dr. Baber, Dr. Klein, fancy credentials. But to be a part of this particular project, and since I'm doing it, there were 2 criteria. One, well, first off, you had to know your stuff. Okay, but if you don't know the material, you're out. But secondly, if Wes Harris wasn't willing to work a shift underground with you or walk a contested picket line with you, you're not going to be part of our project, because this is our story. And this is the story of what I call risk takers and change makers. And so I wasn't interested in a bunch of professors. Now, professors are great, and I've got some wonderful ones. And if I would be willing to say, okay, I'll work a shift underground with you, let's go. But if like, you do great work, but no, I got to trust you. And that's the bottom line.
All right. Well, Wes, I appreciate so much you taking the time to join me today. I want to remind everyone that the show notes page for today's episode is placesandprofiles.com/26. So we'll have a link to Wes's Facebook page. We'll have links to the books Written in Blood and When Miners March. Those will be linked there. As our story, Appalachia.org comes to be, as that gets developed and built up, we'll have links there as well. So placesandprofiles.com/26, placesandprofiles.com/26. That is the place to go for today's episode. And again, Wes, thank you so much for your time today, for being so generous with your time, and for coming on the show to tell us these stories and shed some light on the mine wars, the Esau scrip system, Battle of Blair Mountain, Bill Blizzard, and all of these assorted topics that we've covered here today. So thank you so much.
Well, I thank you. It's been enjoyable, and I wish I could share more. I wish I knew more, and we'll keep at it.
All right. Well, sounds great. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.